Get your attention. Good evening. It's a beautiful day outside. I hope everybody had the opportunity to get out and enjoy some of the day. I hope we have a few more like this so that spring is truly here. So we're here tonight for the next lecture in our North Kingstown 350th lecture series. I don't think I need to spend too much time introducing Tim. I'm pretty certain that most people here know who he is. But Tim is our town historian and emeritus, or whatever the proper title would be. But he's delivered a previous lecture. He is the go-to guy here in town for anything about North Kingstown. And we are very fortunate to have him first putting this lecture series together, and second being one of the presenters. So I think we'll get a lot out of this evening's lecture. So Michelle, I'd like you to come up. The North Kingstown 350th anniversary events were initially funded by the town through $50,000 in ARPA money. Okay, so all the things that we're doing, the lecture series, the parade, the family day, the gala, the initial investments in making those things happen are being done with ARPA money. But it's going to cost more than just $50,000 to do what we would like to do for this. So we rely on sponsors. So I'd like to introduce one of our sponsors. This is Michelle Girasol. Did I pronounce that correctly? Girasoli. Okay. Close. Forgot with the E. So she has a company called Fresh Maps. She's been working with Histwick, and so she's going to tell you about what she does, and then also this lecture was sponsored by the Friends of the North Kingstown Free Library. So whenever you go to the library or talk to somebody from that organization, thank them for their sponsorship. And if after Michelle's done, if you could please thank her for what she's doing to help make this possible. And before you leave, we have a group in the back that is selling swag, stickers and coins. Purchasing those things will help fund the other events that I talked about. And we're always looking for generous sponsors to help fund the family day and parade. So if you want, exciting acts to be in the parade, you know where to find us. Without further ado.
Thank you, Matt. I just want to start with a moment of thanks for Matt for his leadership, both of the committee. He's got great vision and he's doing a great job with a million moving parts. This speaker series is just the tip of the iceberg of how we're celebrating our town's history. I'm a town resident. I've lived here for 15 years. My kids both went through the North Kingstown schools, and I have been a huge fan of Mr. Tim Cranston. How many of you have read one of his books or more of his books? Tim and I are working on the history hunt, scavenger hunt for Family Day in September. It will be a town-wide series of clues, history trivia, and no one's better at writing the stories and the scripts and the interesting places and people and factoids than Tim Cranston. So I will say nothing more, but wait until you see what we're planning. It's so fun, and I'm so delighted to be part of this committee and this speaker series. So without further ado, Tim Cranston.
Thanks a lot, Matt and Michelle. I appreciate your contributions, Michelle, especially. It's great to have this series going. Now, we've spent a couple months in the speaker series talking about the time here in what we now call North Kingstown before it was really well settled by the Anglo-Europeans who came here. And this month we begin with a different village for every month. This is Quidnessett month, and I've also tried to include that in my newspaper columns. Today we had a Quidnessett-related story. We had a couple in the past weeks. And Quidnessett is a good place to start because really, although a lot of folks, when you automatically kind of intuitively think about where did North Kingstown begin, your mind would go to Wickford because it's got all those great old houses. But, Wickford really was a latecomer. I mean, folks were settling in North Kingstown in the early 1600s, and Wickford wasn't even begun until 1709. So although it looks like it's the oldest place around, it really isn't. And Quidnessett is one of those areas that is one of the older places around. Along what the Boston Post Road, the now Post Road area, and Quidnessett are the very first places that settlers came and began to settle in what became North Kingstown. So it's a place with a long history. I'd like to start out I'm curious, how many folks here live in Quidnessett? Do we get a good turnout? I sure hope so. Great, that's good. And another question that I have, and this has come up many times, some of the stories we'll talk about today have to do with some very interesting folks who were from outside of North Kingstown who summered here, folks who were part of the industrial age in Providence and other areas. And every time I go to a talk, I often come across somebody who said, my grandfather worked for that person. My great-grandfather worked. My dad worked for that person. Do we have anybody here whose relatives ever worked for any of the folks who were out there in Quidnessett? Any of the Hanleys, the Davalls, the Knights, the Fletchers, who were out there and virtually owned the entire place? That's too bad, because there are folks out there still who have a really intimate connection to this part of the story. So it'd be great at some point we can get in touch with some of those folks, maybe have them interviewed to talk about what it was like for their families to work on these extraordinary farms. So let's begin. Quidnessett is one of the large former villages that make up the town of North Kingstown, and as I said, we're going to go through all these month by month until we get to the end of the year. And residents still refer to areas by name, but Wickford, the town center famous for its homes, is perhaps the only one well known to visitors. And Quidnessett is bordered on the north by the Hunt River and on the south by Fishing Cove and Mill Creek. We have a couple of pictures here to show both of those areas. People ask me about the names of places in North Kingstown. It's kind of interesting. Most of them have come from the Narragansett language and have been anglicized and mispronounced and made into these words. And it's funny how they've been misplaced. Most of the area that we would think of as Quidnessett was known by the Narragansett people as the Petwamut, which was called the Land of Many Fires. It was an area that was densely settled, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The word Quidnessett is from the Narragansett word Aquidnessett, which refers to a location, as all Narragansett words do. There were no ownership names in the Narragansett culture. They were only locational names. And Aquidnessett means the place by the small island. Now, if you think about the shoreline of North Kingstown and you stop a little bit and looked at a map, you would probably be able to intuitively figure out the place by the small island is actually the place where Smith's Castle is. Aquidnessett, place by the small island. And of course, the folks who settled there, they grabbed a word for part of the area that they owned, which they changed into Cocumcussick, but it was really Cowcowquesick. And Cowcowquesick means high place almost completely surrounded by water. And that refers to Wickford. So all up and down the shoreline as we go through these areas that have these obvious Native American names, they meant something to the Native American people, and I think it's important that we kind of point them out. And of course, the Narragansett people, as more and more settlers came, and even prior to the onset of the King Philip's War, through deals that were just not correct, and we'll talk about this as we move on to the next slide. Some of these deals that were made were the Anglo-Europeans taking advantage of the Native American idea that they didn't understand ownership of land. They signed deeds to sell things off to settlers who came here, but they really felt like they were signing a treaty to live together in peace and harmony on the piece of land. Because they had no concept of owning land. Owning land meant nothing to them. They were a part of the land. They were stewards of the land for sure, but they would never call themselves the owners of a place. So the history of Quidnessett area, North Kingstown, begins with a Native American settlement known as Potawatomi, as I said, on either side of what's now the Hunt or Green River. And you can see it in the very top of this map of the Atherton purchasers. And it was noted by early explorers, especially Verrazano, who came here and sailed up the Narragansett Bay very early on in the late 1500s, as he reported back to the folks who were sponsoring him, the royal families mostly in Spain and France that were sponsoring his work. He noted to them, and he went from just about the Cape Cod all the way down to the Carolinas, up and down the shoreline, stopping and exploring. And he said that he pulled into the Narragansett Bay, and he's reported back to his sponsors that this location here, the western shores of the Narragansett Bay, that's what we call it now, was the most densely settled place that he came across in the entire eastern seaboard. And he talked about going ashore and meeting with Narragansett chieftains, chief sachems, and walking along in the land. And he said he could walk inward on the land from the shoreline for leagues upon leagues without being interrupted by forested land, that the land was cleared and was being actively farmed by the Narragansett people. And that's very true. And all of these lands were cleared. Generation upon generation of Narragansetts had cleared these lands and were actively farming them with their three sisters' crops. And that, indeed, was in some respects, was the downfall of the Narragansett people, because settlers coming here to the New World saw this land here, and this is also true of what was remaining of the Wampanoag tribe as well, that the land was cleared and had been farming. And if you're coming over here and your whole life is based on agriculture, as most folks who were coming into the New World in the 1600s, it was an easy decision in your mind. Which land do you want? Do you want this fertile land that's been farmed for generations and the land that had been managed by the Narragansett people, or do you want to go out in the woods of areas that we might now call West Greenwich or Exeter or Coventry and start chopping down trees and digging up stumps? Well, it's an easy decision. Which are you going to want? You're going to want the land that you know you can get right at it and farm. And that's what happened. This is the map of a group of folks who were called the Atherton purchasers, who made an arrangement with some of the Narragansett chief sachems and began to divide up the land that we now look at as Quidnessett. And of course, this includes both North Quidnessett and what's now Quonset-Davisville, but at that time it was known as South Quidnessett. And you can see all the names of these major purchasers who were involved in this deal to buy up this land from the Native Americans. And as we're talking about the Native Americans, there's in the area around Quidnessett, of course, there's all sorts of interesting Native American landmarks, one of the ones I had in the newspaper column today. But this is probably the most famous, which is the Devil's Foot Rock. Now, the Devil's Foot Rock was not called that by the native people. This was a meeting place near the Chief Sachem village that was along there on the Boston Post Road. This is where Mayan Tanomi and Cananchit had their villages, and this was a place that they would meet together. And the Native American location here was something that was known by the colonists, and they noted this location. The rock was specific in that it had these interesting marks in it. They were, of course, made by geological processes as it was coming up through the ground. But colonists looked at it and thought it looked like the cloven hoofs of the devil. And, of course, they made stories up about it and tried to attribute them to the Narragansett people. So that colonial legend says that the foot of the devil left these marks as it chased an Indian maiden. That's one of the most prominent stories that you hear. Indeed, there was some truth to the stories. The Narragansetts' spiritual, their nature-based spirituality, to have a lot of parallels with Anglo-European religions, in that they did have a creature that might have corresponded with the devil called Hobomok, who was a mischievous spirit who would cause mischief across the lands, and an interesting sidelight. And as a Rhode Islander, I like this one a lot. They said that this particular mischievous devil spirit lived in Connecticut. So, I mean, right behind, he lived on Mount Tom in Connecticut. And since Connecticut was always in that time frame trying to steal Rhode Island away from the Rhode Island colonists, I've always felt there's a certain justice to the fact that the devil actually lives in Connecticut. So, and if you've driven through Connecticut, you probably would agree with me. He's out there on Route 95 working on people right now as we speak. So this is one of the many Native American sorts of landmarks that still exist in the area that we would call Quidnessett, and it's a great place to stop and visit if you're, you want to get out there with yourself or take your kids or grandkids. It's a wonderful place to stop and look at this formations on these stones. And think about the centuries upon centuries of folks who have stood there looking at the same thing. So we go from that Atherton Purchase map and we get into this map, which is a map that comes out of the 1870 map of North Kingstown, and it shows us very clearly the area that was once the Atherton Purchase has now been divided up into North and South Quidnessett. Neither of them had what you would call a village center. I mean, North Quidnessett and South Quidnessett were largely farming communities, and that was what they were all about, agriculture in these time frames. And if you take a look at this map, and you can find this map at the North Kingstown Free Library in the South County Room, you can look at all the names of all the folks who were living in these two small farming communities in the time frame. And then there really are only a handful of names that show up out there. Everybody out there was interrelated. You see them, they're Spinks and Allens, Reynolds and Whitemans, they were Aylesworths. There were just a handful of folks who were living out in North and South Quidnessett, farming the land and living a subsistence farming lifestyle. Nothing really was in the area that you would call industry other than this location. This is the Torgey Grist Mill, which was built in the late 1700s by the Tennant family. And all of these types of farming communities would have a grist mill associated with them. I mean, a grist mill is a place where farmers would take their grain to be ground into flour, take their corn to be ground into cornmeal. Typically, it was a farmer who owned this. He was a farmer who was blessed with a water feature on his land that had enough vertical drop along a stream to power a grist mill. And these locations were oftentimes the beginnings of industry in southern Rhode Island and all across New England in many respects. Grist mills were often the first industrial activity that went on these streams. These streams a century or so later would be supporting textile mills. This particular one, which was a very small stream, only supported this grist mill. After the Tennant family, the Torgey family took it over, and it was called then the Torgey Tide Mill. It had an opportunity where, when it's right on the edge of Camp Avenue, where one of the coves comes in off of the Narragansett Bay, and it could run the mill on a high tide or on a low tide as the stream is going out. So it's kind of an interesting arrangement there. The last miller, George Washington Torgey, also attached that little lean-to shed that you can see on there, and had a small sawmill in it. And this mill was operating all the way up until the 1930s and running at that time frame. As you can imagine, as agriculture changed and small farmers closed up shop, less and less grist mills operated in the area, but this grist mill ran until the 1930s. And it's interesting, this is our first opportunity to talk about rich guys, and rich guys are a really important part of the story of Quidnessett. In the 1930s, the really super rich folks of the United States of America, men who had huge industries, men who made lots of money in a time before income tax, their favorite hobby was not collecting stamps or baseball cards. They really enjoyed recreating colonial villages and making their own colonial village. Just close by to us here, we have Sturbridge Village, which is an exact same type of a thing, run by the brothers who ran the early company called American Optical. American Optical is still around today. They wanted to compete with guys like the Henry Ford and, of course, you want to talk about the ultimate is colonial Williamsburg. But they were all running around the country, going to any place that was colonial and attempting to buy buildings, take them apart, and move them to their recreated colonial villages. Henry Ford came over one day and knocked on the door of the grist mill and told George Washington Torgey he would love to buy the thing and take it apart and drive it all to Dearborn, Michigan, and rebuild it in the middle of his colonial village. Torgey told him no, and he came back, and William Anthony, who bought it from Torgey's, he asked him again. William Anthony told him no. 2 years or so after the last attempt by Ford to buy this building and the grist mill machinery in there, the 1938 hurricane took care of it and wiped the Torgey grist mill off the map. So in Somerset, maybe it would have been okay for Henry to have bought this, but who would have known that that was going to happen? And if you're a postcard collector of North Kingstown postcards, there are a whole ton of various postcard views of the grist mill. So, as I mentioned, South Quidnessett is actually been pretty much completely swallowed up by Quonset-Davisville. And we'll talk more about that as we move along. This particular farmhouse here, which is on Newcomb Road, if you drive by it, set back a little back, is one of the last surviving farmhouses in what was then South Quidnessett. The farmhouse was the center of a 50-acre farm carved out of a larger Spink farm that was owned by Sam Spink. Now, interesting time frame, in that time frame, there were 3 people living in the area named Sam Spink. So they all got nicknames. Old Sam Spink, Young Sam Spink, and this particular Sam Spink had the very interesting nickname of Wooden Leg Sammy Spink, because he had a wooden leg. Now, how do I know all this stuff? Well, surprise, surprise. With a family like mine who's been here way too long. Who was his wife? Anne Cranston Spink. She was the first wife of Sam Spink, and she died of heart failure at a very early age, and in very typical fashion. I mean, we have to think about marriage as a very different thing then than it is now. Now, marriage is really something that we think about that is really connected to romantic love. And perhaps for a lot of marriages, first marriages in that time frame, that was the truth. But in an age when there were nobody around to take care of kids if something happened, and men had to work, and oftentimes women were dying in childbirth, second marriages were a whole different ball of wax. A man who lost his wife in childbirth, for instance, was at a loss. He had a farm to run. He had perhaps children or toddlers around, and he had a nursing infant with no mother. So typically what you found was a very, very quick remarriage to a woman who was probably at that time perhaps either a widow herself or else considered to be a spinster, a really, really old woman, like 30 maybe, some spinster woman who maybe even 32 who couldn't find a husband. And indeed in this case, when Anne passed away suddenly at an early age, and this happened very often, Sam married her unmarried sister. They already knew each other. They knew who they were. They knew what each other's pluses and minuses, faults and attributes were, and so it was a very common practice. And it's interesting, they're all buried in Elm Grove, Wooden Leg Sammy in the middle, and Anne on one side, and Elizabeth on the other. But it's interesting because even when I got to get into this learning about local history, I just never really thought about marriage in any other than in the context that we're used to thinking about it. And that is really not what marriage was all about for a great portion of the time that America was America. This is another interesting feature out in Quidnessett. This is on Fletcher Road. Interesting looking little house. But reality, what it is, it's the very first location for what is now the Quidnessett Baptist Church. At that time, it was called the Baptist Church of Quidnessett Neck. It was an offshoot of the Allenton Baptist Church on Tower Hill Road. as you can see, the connections there, the land was donated by members of the Allen family, who were also connected to the Allens, who were the namesake of the village of Allenton. They were kind of getting tired of getting into their wagons and driving all the way down there to go to church. So they had enough people nearby to form their own congregation. They petitioned the ruling folks at Allenton Baptist Church and started their own church up here in the north end of town. Interestingly enough, the exact same situation occurred in Wickford. When Wickford ended up with a large Baptist community and they were tired of going down to Allenton, they petitioned again the Baptist Church, which I like to kind of call the mother church of Baptist Church in South County, to open up the Wickford Baptist Church. And indeed, the Allenton Baptist Church out there now is really the birthplace of 4 or 5 small, and some, as you can see with Quidnessett and Wickford, some larger Baptist churches in South County. Now, this is Deacon George Allen, who's one of the earliest folks involved in this particular transfer of power from Allenton Baptist Church to this new Baptist Church of Quidnessett Neck. He donated land for this. And I tell you, by looking at this fellow, if he was speaking in the meeting house, I bet you no one gave him any guff. I think he would probably frighten children. He looks like a serious, stern man. But as I said, this branch of the Allen family was instrumental in setting up a permanent church in the Quidnessett area. And after connecting later on with the mill owners that were now in Davisville, they wanted to find a new location that was more centered between Quidnessett and Davisville. And this is the reason for the relocation from Fletcher Road out to Post Road, so that the Quidnessett Baptist Church could serve both communities and have the journey to church each Sunday be of equal distance. Now, George Allen has left us with a very interesting artifacts in and of itself, and this too is out in Quidnessett near the intersection with Quail Drive. And it's the stone foundations of George Allen's dairy barns. Now, these foundations are probably 15 feet high that we see here, and they are just the lower part of the 2 dairy barns that would have been there protecting the dairy cows of George Allen. On top of this would have been a full wooden structure that would have been constructed that would have been used for hay and fodder storage throughout the year. And this was an enormous dairy complex that was out here in the middle to late 1800s. These are still there to this day, and right next door, the foundation of the giant silos that George Allen had on his dairy farm. And I think these are great to point out exactly how massive the dairy operation was in the area of Quidnessett as we went into the period after the Civil War. Dairy farming was it out there, and these bases of these 2 giant silos, which would have been used to hold silage, which is a type of corn that would be grown, and then stored in these silos for the cows to eat across the winter. It gives you a sense of how massive this operation was out here, that they needed this kind of storage not only for the silage to feed the cows, but those 2 giant barns to take care of the cows during the winter. And as I said, the folks whose property these are on now, who live there on the road right near Quail Drive, they're really proud of these artifacts of bygone day. And it's worth a drive to go by and just stop and look at them. They're extraordinary, and they really give you an idea of what was going on up there in Quidnessett as far as the dairy operations that were happening up there. Now, there's only one of these style of barns left in North Kingstown. It's at the Westmoreland Farms, and it's about 1/4 of the size of George Allen's barns. But I did want to put a picture in here so you could get a sense of how these barns looked when they were fully formed. So you can see this from as you go down Tower Hill Road off there, and you see the style of it. You see the lower stone foundation. Now that stone foundation for that barn is probably about 5 feet high, and the stone foundation for George Allen's barns are 15 feet high. So it gives you a sense of the scale of those barns, how big they would have been, and the operations that would have gone on inside. And it's interesting for the Allen family because early on, even in the 1700s, even in the Revolutionary period, the Allen families many of the members of the Allens, especially who were living in the Quidnessett area, were stone merchants. They would sell building stone. They would move it around on ships on the Narragansett Bay. And another artifact that exists in North Kingstown that was constructed by the Allen family is the old stone barn that is now part of the Carriage Inn. Again, kind of a calling card for the kind of work that these stone merchant, stone mason family could do. And these stone barns that we see, I don't know that the Westmoreland Farms barn was built by then, but certainly the ones up there in Quidnessett were products of the Allens. This is another great house out on Fletcher Road, and it was built in the early 1800s by George Whiteman, and the Whitemans were one of the very early families out there in Quidnessett. And it was a simpler house when he had it. In 1868, it was purchased by one of the earliest of the wealthy Providence folks who began to see an idea where they wanted to get out of the city. They had the financial wherewithal to have summer houses. So Nathan Waldron purchased this house in 1868 and extensively remodeled it into his summer estate. Now Nathan was an ingenious entrepreneur in the time frame of the 1870s up into the turn of the century. He started a business that was really quite different. I mean, of course, there's always been grocery stores and dry goods stores in little villages all across the United States as it was developing. Most of those stores, though, got their goods that they sold from local farmers. But as the Industrial Revolution advanced and as agriculture, due to some changes in the way the sense of scale of agriculture, when the Erie Canal was built, it opened up the area around New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio to large-scale farming. And the Erie Canal and all the roadways connected to it allowed these large-scale farms to have the ability to move vast amounts of produce into the Northeast where there was lots of people. And it really drove small farmers out of business. It really changed the landscape during the Industrial Revolution. You know, that's why so many folks who were in the French Canadian provinces, for instance, had to close their farms down and come down to places like Rhode Island and even North Kingstown and start working in textile mills, because it really changed things. So when this occurred, then there was a need for people to distribute these groceries and produce that was being grown on these large farms in the area that was then called out west, here in the east, and that's when wholesale grocers came around. They would the first people who were involved in the produce markets that set up in Providence and big cities like that. They purchased groceries at wholesale and then had salesmen who went around and sold their produce, delivered it along with grains and such to all the small mom and pop stores that were all around the United States of America. And Nathan was in the ground floor of this. And it really changed the game for moving groceries around, and beginning of a natural progression that ends us with the kinds of supermarkets that we have today, all bringing produce from California and Mexico and all over the world in a moment's notice to New England. And this was the beginning of that all. But Nathan was smart, and he had a lot of money. And again, as I said, there was no income tax back then, and he was doing fabulously well. And he had this small Whiteman farmhouse modified into his summer estate. And it actually was bigger than we see it today. Before, it had twin four-story octagonal towers on either end, It had its own bowling alley and a large gazebo used as an outdoor summer casino in the back. In the early 20th century, it was purchased by Joseph Fletcher, a prominent Providence textile mill owner and judge. He had a lot of connections in Providence and a lot of connections in state politics. And the road, which was formerly known as Aylesworth Road, named after the Aylesworth family who settled along it in the very early 1700s, was magically changed to Fletcher Road because of this politically connected man who lived in this fine summer house. And if you live in Quidnessett, I'm sure you've driven by this house, as you're going up North Quidnessett Road. It's now a private home, but this was actually North Kingstown District Schoolhouse number 1, the Quidnessett District Schoolhouse, constructed in 1828, and once had 2 front doors, one where you see the door today and the other where the window is on the porch, one where the boys would go in and one where the girls would go in. And the district schoolhouse system was instituted in the community, and not just North Kingstown, but all over the place, in the 19th century as states decided that it was important for communities to provide public education for their children. And the way it was done in the beginnings was that the towns was divided up into districts, and people who lived in those districts were pretty much told, figure it out. We expect you to have a school in that district by X time. We're going to give you some seed money, and the town gave each district some seed money, probably $500 or something of that nature, and said, get going, get a schoolhouse, build it, find it, convert a house, hire a teacher, and provide education for your children. Typically it was 100 days, and typically it was only up until 6th grade. But that was the beginnings of public schools here in North Kingstown, and the Quidnessett District Schoolhouse was one of the earliest ones that got along. And as you can imagine, districts where you had people with some wealth had some pretty nice schools, and places where you didn't have a lot of wealth in the poor areas, Slocum, and of course Swamptown, a place dear to my heart, had very poor schools, had very difficult time paying for teachers. But this Quidnessett District Schoolhouse, with the kind of wealth that was existing in Quidnessett at that time, was a school that was well staffed and well maintained by the community. And it was up to the people who lived in that area to not only start the school up and staff it, but to maintain the building throughout the time frame that we were in district school system. South Quidnessett had a similar school building itself as well. Another house that if you drive up and down North Quidnessett Road, I'm sure you've seen. I don't know if it's still yellow. Elizabeth, who took this picture many years ago, she remembers that it's a beautiful house, but it has an interesting story. Nathan, after he sold his house to Fletcher's, decided he wanted a new house because Mrs. Waldron wanted something modern. And at that time frame, there was a magazine out there, Chappelle's Modern Homes. An architect named Robert Chappelle, again, an entrepreneurial thinker looking at the way the world was now and seeing opportunities, decided that he would begin to hire architects right out of school and have them design plans, which he would then feature in his magazine, just little snippets and pictures, and talk about how neat they could be, how wonderful it could be. And he was smart enough to realize that what he wanted to feature in this magazine called Chappelle's Modern Home was the types of modern conveniences that would appeal to housewives. Indoor plumbing, always a great thing, don't you think? Central heat, another wonderful thing, These are the kind of things that he had in his homes, and your wife would go through the magazine and say, I like this one, and this one is house plan number 570, and then you'd buy the plans, a set of plans, you'd mail in some certain amount of money to Chappelle's office, he'd send you out the set of plans, and you'd get your house built. There's a handful of Chappelle's Modern Homes in North Kingstown, and they're harken back to this time frame when, again, things were changing as the Industrial Revolution moved along, and there were lots of opportunities, and this particular idea by Robert Chappelle was one of them. The Knight family eventually bought this and used it as one of the houses for the Knights, and we'll talk about them in a little bit as well. Another great house in North Quidnessett, the Whiteman Homestead House. And it's amazing. It was the earliest part of it, which is on the left side of this image, was a stone ender house. It was constructed in 1682 for Valentine Whiteman. Valentine Whiteman was one of the most important settlers in the area. He was a friend of Roger Williams, and he was known to be kind of a polyglot. He could speak languages fluently and learn them very quickly, and he quickly learned the language of all the Native Americans around here, and he was used as an interpreter in negotiations between folks like Roger Williams and the Narragansett people, or the Wampanoag people as need be. As time went on, this house has an addition added to it, amazingly enough. So you have a house built in the 17th century, an addition made in the 18th century, an addition in the 19th century, an addition in the 20th century, and then that neat porch on the edge in the 21st century. So a home with parts that were built during 5 separate centuries. It's one of the oldest houses in the state of Rhode Island. If you look at that core section there on the left side of the image, and it has an important story. 1682, George Whiteman married into the Updike family. Again, marrying well made a lot of difference, increased his land holdings to get beyond this house, and was made for them with this one marriage into the wealthy Updikes of Cocumscussock, and made them into power players up in the area. It's a great house, and the present day owners take wonderful care of it, and it's really a remarkable testament to a house that has lasted through the centuries. So now we're getting into the period of time when North Quidnessett becomes more and more noticed by wealthy folks. We've talked a little bit about Nathan Waldron, and then Isaac Goff is another guy, a Providence businessman, who came into Quidnessett along with Judge Joseph Fletcher. These 3 gentlemen, they didn't have a hobby like Henry Ford of colonial villages, but they loved harness racing. That was their thing. They loved trotters. They liked harness racings, and they thought this is the perfect place that we can indulge ourselves in our favorite hobby, which is harness racing. This field is at the corner of Harrison and Petty. It's still there to this day. If you're a Quidnessett person, I'm sure you drive by it and see it. And it's an interesting field. The town purchased it a decade or 2 back, and you just can't imagine, if you don't know about it, what this field is really all about. And been blessed by the fact that in the middle 1930s, the U.S. government, when they were looking for a place to build the naval base that became Quonset in Davisville, did dozens of flybys over the area and took aerial photographs of everything. So we can get a sense of what this field was really all about when it was in its prime. So this is from the 1930s, and we see the arrow pointing to that Whiteman house, which at that time had been purchased half by Isaac Goff and half by Joseph Fletcher, and their horse barns and the incredible trotter track that they decided to build out there for their hobby, a private trotter track. You don't find that very often. The gentlemen I mentioned, Isaac Goff and Nathan Waldron and Judge Fletcher and a few other folks who lived in the area who enjoyed this hobby, had special clays and brought in to make the trotter track. And if you see down in the bottom corner, you can see a little house there, right where the line goes across it. That's the house that we were talking about earlier on Fletcher Road. So they're connected together, and they have this entire wonderful playground for these 4 families who are then out there. Joseph Fletcher, an industrialist involved in the textile industry. Nathan Waldron, who was involved in the, as I said, as a wholesale grocer. Goff, who was another industrialist from Providence, and a few other guys. Now, this is not a picture of that track, but it's a picture of a track in the same time frame, and this is most certainly what that place looked like. This harness track in Bethel, Maine was the same time frame and the same type of track, and shows us exactly the harness racing teams that we would have seen out there in this special private harness racing track that these folks had out there. And as time went on, more and more of North Quidnessett got bought up by these folks. And as you drive up Quidnessett Road, I'm sure you've all noted that it's lined with beautiful stone walls. But if you take a look at those stone walls, the material that they're made out of, they're not made out of round farm field stones. They're made out of actual cut stone that was brought in to highlight the entryway into the world of the rich and famous who lived out here. And who was one of the biggest and baddest of them all? We'll go to this house, which, if you're a golfer, has been around for an awful long time. Know that this is the old Quidnessett Country Club building. It was originally built as a much smaller home and owned again by the Whiteman family, who were major farmers in the area. But it was purchased and dramatically expanded by C. Prescott Knight, the president of Knight Textile Empire, which eventually changed its name to Fruit of the Loom. We all probably have their underwear on, let's face it. But, so Knight is interesting, and he is one of the ones who really came in here, and having him here made more and more people take note. Walter Hanley, a Providence brewer who ran the Hanley Ales Company, which was a competitor to the Narragansett Beer Company, he settled down here as well and eventually bought this house from Knight. The president of the Narragansett Brewery at the time came down here and settled as well. They all came down in here to live the extraordinary summer life that they had here. Now, but, Knight, he wasn't really a harness racing guy. He liked polo. Everybody's got their own ideas about what you want. And again, Quidnessett, with all of this farmlands, were perfect for polo. But, Prescott Knight, he wanted to be able to do polo in the winter. Well, why wouldn't you if you're a gazillionaire? So if you can see at the top, we have 3 indoor polo stadiums so that he could play polo in Quidnessett all year round. And all the land around there, and all of this land is now the Quidnessett Country Club, shows features that Mr. Knight had out there. And again, he bought all this land in the time that people would think nobody could buy it. And it's another great part of the story of Quidnessett. And it's about the Depression. Now, we all like to think about the Depression and a terrible thing it was, because that's the story we were told. But, and it was a terrible thing for the vast majority of people. The Great Depression destroyed lives. People committed suicide over it. People's families were broken up. Villages were gone. Businesses closed. But if you were a rich person at the time frame whose money was not invested in stocks, but was invested in real things. If your money is invested in land, if your money is invested in an industry that makes stuff, you didn't lose very much. And those folks, the Knights and the Fletchers and the West and the other people we've talked about, they might look at the Great Depression and call it the Great Opportunity. Because if you think about it, these folks who have not really been hit too hard by the Depression, they operate in a world where everybody else around them is desperate for money. In North Quidnessett, farmers were closing up shop. People's houses were going in foreclosure. And people like the Knights could come in, swoop in, and buy up farms for next to nothing. We'll talk about Charles Davall a little later, but he bought up 6 or 8 farms to make his hunting retreat here in South Quidnessett. And the Knights did the same. Even more importantly, you want caretakers on your property. You're not really going to be there all the time. You have a fine house up in Providence too, on the hill in Providence as well. So you're not going to be here all the time. So you want caretakers. You have, like here we see in this aerial photograph, you've got orchards, you've got barns, you've got animals. The Knights were also interested in raising heritage breeds of dairy cows. And so you wanted people to take care of all this stuff for you. Well, you could hire locals for next to nothing because everybody was desperate for work. And so the Great Depression in the period of the late 20s into the 30s, for folks like C. Prescott Knight and his ilk here living in Quidnessett, was the great opportunity for them. You know, and like every good millionaire of a time frame, it's important to have a yacht. So you wanted to make sure you had a house on the water, and C. Prescott Knight was no exception. This is his yacht, the Gilnockie. You know, and he too, he had these yachts, and all the folks back then had a yacht. I mean, so you could get back and forth, so you could go over to Newport to go to all the events there. And again, in a place like North Kingstown, particularly in Wickford, you wanted a ship's crew. There's all sorts of out-of-work seamen looking for work, and you could hire them to man your yacht. Now, even the Brown family decided to get into this, and if you've been up by Scalabrini Via, you've seen this. This is the John Carter Brown summer house. And John Carter Brown's book collection formed the basis of the library at Brown University. He built this summer estate house in 1872. The land was formerly owned by his father-in-law, also a wealthy individual named Crawford Allen, a descendant of the Allens. He was a descendant of the Quidnessett settlers. He had this land. Crawford now was a ship and transportation magnate, and Allen Ave up in Providence is named after him. And they came and spent their summers in this beautiful home. Get another view of it here. And again, it's right next to Scalabrini, and it was the beginning of the Scalabrini. In 1907, John Carter Brown had passed away by then, and his widow, who had plenty of income at that time, decided to decorate the interior of the house in a Japanese style, and held on to it for quite a while, but then after a time donated it to the state of Rhode Island for use as a children's hospital. It's a beautiful home. In 1957, the Society of St. Charles, a group of Catholic monks, purchased the property from the state of Rhode Island after the hospital closed down, and made it into a retirement home at that time for their members. And over the years, that's been transformed into this Scalabrini Via nursing home that we know today, and a wonderful location that it is, and such a great facility. And of course, if you're going to be a rich guy like John Carter Brown, even your garage has to be fancy. So, you know, these folks were all out there, competing with each other, trying to make a statement. Yeah, Prescott Knight, wait till you see the barn I'm going to have. And, you know, they were in competition for each other. You know, you can see even in the carriage house that John Carter Brown had built for his fine home. And these buildings are still up there. You can certainly drive down the Scalabrini driveway and take a look at them. So here again is part of the John Carter Brown estate. The beach house is there where they went down to the beach, the carriage house, and the house itself, taken from these same aerial photographs taken by the Navy. This is another interesting house that's near Forge Road's intersection with North Quidnessett Road there. The Daniel Gould Allen house, which was constructed in 1862 by a Wickford carpenter on the site of a smaller Allen family home. And the Allen family, you know, we've talked a lot about them. They were the heart and soul of Quidnessett. They had spread far and wide and done pretty darn well. Daniel Allen was at that time the founder of the East Greenwich Academy, one of the earliest private high schools in the state at that time. Because high school, as I said, school ended at 6th grade in the public school system. So something to take care of your kids on in education so they could perhaps go to institutes of higher learning would require them to go to a private high school. And East Greenwich Academy was that location where people who wanted to send their kids on for their education sent them, and Daniel Gould Allen was the guy who set that thing up. At the time, he also wrote the very first book, which gives us an idea about the story of Quidnessett in 1895. Again, that's another book. If you have a great interest in Quidnessett, you could get at the library. C. Prescott Knight eventually purchased this house for his namesake son, Clinton P. Knight, and added on a large addition, which you can see from when you go down Forge Road. In the very beginnings of the Quidnessett time frame, almost all of it was owned in part by the Reynolds family. And this is the entryway, which again is on North Quidnessett Road, to one of the major Reynolds family burial grounds. And this includes the graves of the very first James and Deborah Reynolds, who were one of the earliest 1600 settlers that came and settled here in Quidnessett, as I said, even before the King Philip's War. This is the inside of it. One of the, in the turn of the century, Thomas Reynolds, a descendant of theirs, fixed up the graveyard, added a large monument, and put up the fine stone wall around this Reynolds family graveyard. It's still maintained to this day by a group called the Reynolds Family Association. This is one of the earlier Reynolds houses, and again, this, you drive down the road in North Quidnessett, Essex Road, and you see this. It's a great house. This is the third house that was on the site, and it was built in 1802 by Jeffrey Davis of Davisville. And as I mentioned, as time went on, the villages of Connecticut and Davisville begin to, mostly through their church, become connected, and he built this house for them. The very first house that sat on the site was built in 1660 and was destroyed during the King Philip's War. There was a second house built on the site, but it was relocated to Austin Road and still sits there to this day. It was built in the late 1690s. That house is still on Austin Road to this day, and this bigger house was put in its place. Although it was a massive farm, most of that land is long gone, but the property at this time does include a mid-19th century barn in the back that's been modified. One of the many Reynolds who came out of this Reynolds family was William A. Reynolds, who actually lived in this house and, was sent off to get his education. He graduated from Wesleyan University in 1858 and then opened his own college that he started out, Dover English and Classic School in Dover, Delaware. After the Civil War, he opened another Institute of Higher Education in Wilmington, Delaware, called Wilmington Classic Academy, and he finished his career as a professor at Goldley Commercial College. And he's just a farm boy who came from a wealthy family who made good. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the South Quidnessett area, and this is an interesting aerial shot of South Quidnessett, which shows what existed in the front part. Way in the back, up at the top, what you're looking at up there is Post Road, and here you have the largest landowner in the front part of South Quidnessett, and that was the Romano family, and the Romano vineyard was there. I did say vineyard. It was the largest scale vineyard in New England at the time. Acres and acres of grapes, 370 acres in total, run by an immigrant family from Italy called the Romanos. The Romano vineyard began in 1908 by John and Drusalina Romano, John's brother Ernest, and Annabella and Michael DeRenzi. The DeRenzis were friends of the Romanos who lived together in Italy, and they moved over here and began their own vineyard. It was 370 acres in total, 100 of acres which was planted in Concord, Clinton, Delaware, and Catawba grapes. And the remainder of the acres was run as a commercial vegetable farm. These are some of the labels from their bottles, Devil's Foot Red and Rhode Island Red, and the Romanos were really large-scale vintners. They did an awful lot made a lot of wine, hundreds and hundreds of gallons each and every year. Amazingly enough, as you see here in the early 1900s, John shot an intruder on the farm, and rather than go to court, he left the country and left his wife here. And his wife, Druselina, eventually married John's brother Carmen after getting a divorce, and moved on. Druselina was really the heart and soul of this operation. She kept it going for the Romano family. There's still Romano descendants in North Kingstown and East Greenwich to this day who can connect back to this family and this enormous vineyard that operated out there for 30 years. And I always get a good kick out of their advertisements and marketing during the Prohibition, because they continued to operate full bore, but they declared that their thousands of gallons of wine they make was used completely for ecclesiastical purposes. People were taking a lot of communion back then, I guess. And the Romanos were in there and a lot of communions, making great communion wine that ended up in people's houses during Prohibition. Okay, another enormous portion of South Quidnessett ended up in the hands of someone we spoke about earlier, Charles Davall, the founder and sole owner of Davall Rubber, which made rubber medical products. And Davall is still around to this day. It's a viable company, and Charles was a educated man. His father sent him to college, and he expanded his company and made it and kept up with medical technology and was doing extraordinarily well. During the time frame of the Depression, he purchased 6 farms in total and combined them to create a gentleman's hunting estate of more than 1,000 acres. This was just his place. He liked to hunt. He was not into polo ponies or harness racing. He liked to hunt. He had the entire 1,000 acres fenced in, and he had Davall Pond, which is still out there on the base today, carved out of a marshland so he could have a place where he could stock it with fish and wildfowl that he could hunt on. And he had the entire 1,000-acre parcels stocked with pheasants and deer and other animals that he could bring his Providence industrialist friends down, and they could go out hunting on his private hunting area. He had 4 or 5 families that he hired to run the place for him, take care of the grounds, make sure the fences were in order, etc. And this was just a place he went in the summertime to go hunting. This is the main house of the Davall's farm, which he called Wild Acre Farm, which was adjacent to the man-made pond we talked about, which is now Davall Pond. And as I said, hundreds of acres of his property were fenced in and stocked with game for Davall and his associates to hunt. These are a picture of the entryway to his compound. He also had challenged artists and hired them to make particular outdoor art sculpture for himself. This is a carving of a Narragansett Indian chief sachem carved by Providence artist Henry Schoenhart, and he called this the Spirit of Wild Acres. This statue still runs around today. This picture is not accurate anymore. It used to be in East Greenwich, and now I guess it has moved to another area as a family who purchased it, moves it around. And the family, whose members I know, tell me that everywhere they live, somebody from Shawmut Bank is always coming down to try to buy this head from them, and they're sick and tired. So if you know anybody from Shawmut Bank, tell them to leave the people alone. They don't want to sell it. Okay, so he had that on the entry to his house, but on the entry to the hunting area, he had these 2 bronze panther sculptures made by noted artist Christian Peterson. And these were on 2 different pillars as you entered the hunting area. This actually is out of date now. The 2 wildcats are no longer in Vermont at Bentley College. They are out in the Midwest now at a college where Christian Peterson spent his last days as an art professor and helping the folks who run this art school out in I believe it was Michigan, track down these cats and learn their provenance. I had the pleasure of helping them out with this, and these particular wonderful sculptures can now be seen on the campus of the college that Peterson finally finished his career at. And of course, like every other rich guy, you have to have a big yacht. And Dave All had the biggest one of all in the area. And he also had a substantial wharf constructed off of the property in Narragansett Bay, suitable for the yacht, the Paragon. Dave All's instructions to the builder at Bath Iron Works was he wanted a yacht big enough to go through the Panama Canal, but with the draft shallow enough so he could go into Newport Harbor. Picky, huh? Jeez. So this 140-foot long steel yacht fit both those requirements, and it was tied up to the pier at Davisville, waiting for him to take off whenever he wanted to. In World War II, the U.S. Navy took the yacht away from the Dave All family and used it. It was so big and so substantially built that they used it as a coastal patrol boat in California during the entire of World War II. So, now we all know what happened out there. All this especially in South Quidnessett, this wonderland that was out there in South Quidnessett for folks like Charles Dave All, and this extraordinary vineyard owned by the Romano family all disappeared because in 1938 the U.S. government was really actively looking for a place to build a military base. Now, it's important to think about the time frame that construction occurred, because we think about World War II, and it obviously has something to do with World War II, but let's think about when they decided to do this, when the Secretary of War met up with old Franklin Roosevelt and said, you know, we need a base in the northeastern United States. We want to be able to find the location that is absolutely closest to England and Russia, because we want to stay out of the war. And in 1938, that's what this base was all about. It was about the Lend-Lease program that was existing at the time frame, trying to supply England and Russia during the beginnings of the war. And that's really why they chose this wonderful location on the Narragansett Bay. You go out in the bay and you're right in the Gulf Stream, and before you know it, your cargo ships can go from America to England or to Russia and resupply these countries as World War II was beginning. But of course, after Pearl Harbor, everything changed. But in the 30s, when this was being built, that was the purpose for it. These are photos from the Historic American Building Survey, which shows construction workers arriving by car and a special train that came out from Providence to help build this base. And this base was built extraordinarily fast. It's an enormous base, and there was a lot of hard feelings in North Kingstown at that time. The government in the beginning wanted this to be hush-hush, so they hired real estate agents who surreptitiously came to North Kingstown and started buying land where they could. When Charles Dave All passed away, they jumped on the opportunity to purchase the land, the 1,000 acres Charles Dave All had from his widow. The motivating factor for being sure they had to have that piece of land was the yacht, Paragon's dock. That dock was big enough for ships to tie up to that could be used to begin to supply England. So that dock was there. They wanted the land. They bought the Romano vineyard and from the Romano family. And then when they couldn't get any more of the properties, then they came in and took all the land away from everybody else from eminent domain. People whose families had lived out there since the 1600s were told by the U.S. government, well, we're sorry, too bad, there's a war on, we need your land. This is what we're going to give you for it. There's no negotiation. You could have sold it when we had our agents here, although they never told them that that's what was going on. And the land was taken by eminent domain by the government, and the construction of the base began in 1939. A huge undertaking. Think about the size and the scale of what is Quonset Davisville. The land was all cleared, houses were moved, rail lines were brought in, a giant airport was constructed over the ocean. It was all fill. All the hangars were built in 2 years. The hustle and bustle that must have been going on at Quonset Davisville must have been a marvel to see. And one of the things that's interesting, and you could see in the front of this picture, you see that small truck there with gravel in it. It's interesting because that gravel was something that was also changed the landscape of most of South County, because the U.S. government put out an all points bulletin that we'll buy fill from anybody. You got fill, we'll buy it. Bring it by, we'll pay for it. And remember, we're just at the time where we're getting out of the Depression. There's farmers out there who have their sons, who have their farms. And anytime they had spare time, what do? They went out in the woods and filled the truck up with fill and drove it down and had it dumped in the area that is now the Quidnessett Naval Air Station, the airfields out there that the National Guard use. Truck after truck of gravel came out of the farmlands and woods of North Kingstown, South Kingstown, Exeter, etc. So if you walk through the woods in North Kingstown now and you see a place where there was a big hole dug, that's where that gravel all ended up, all hauled truck by truck like this to fill in the land that became the air base there. Of course, we're talking about a large area, thousands of acres of land that had been lived on for generations, centuries really. And one of the most important tasks during this, already the U.S. government has really ticked off the entire population of the northern half of North Kingstown. And now you have all of these historic cemeteries out there, all these cemeteries that were associated with all these farms that had been there since the beginning of time. So part of what had to be done at that location in Quidnessett was all of those cemeteries had to be relocated. And again, this is an interesting story which has a direct connection to my family. The person they hired was my grandfather, George C. Cranston, to accomplish this task. They wanted to make sure that they hired somebody local to do it because they knew that they would be respected members of the community. So they hired my grandfather and another man who was at that time the superintendent of the Quidnessett Cemetery to do this job. And these two gentlemen got together and knew how important it was. The Navy told them it's important now that we do something to heal the rift that's going on here in North Kingstown. And if we do this wrong, it's going to make things worse. So what they did was, as this hustle and bustle, this massive base is being constructed, as trains are coming and going, and my grandfather and a crew and a crew from the cemetery were going out to all these little cemeteries, and there were literally 20 or 30 small cemeteries in the property, and very carefully excavating the graves, packing them up what was there, putting them into new caskets, loading them onto the back of a truck, and moving from grave to grave, picking up every gravestone, every footstone, every marker, even if it was a wooden casket and all that was left with it was the handles and the nails. They picked up every bit of it and put it all together and hauled it back to this location in Quidnessett Cemetery where everybody was reburied. And the process was intriguing. This was a process that was developed through these two gentlemen, my grandfather and the Quidnessett Cemetery, and the people who were in charge of building Quidnessett Davis at this time. They wanted a certain modicum of respect to be shown to these remains as they were moved out of the construction areas. So as a construction crew, as a cemetery removal crew was finishing up and loading up and heading to Quidnessett, there was a communications from every crew that they would go by, everybody building everything. And as this truck with these trucks with these caskets on them would move through with a military guard procession through the construction area, all construction would halt as the crew went by. All the workers would drop their tools and stand in silence each and every time one of these family cemeteries were moved to Quidnessett. And I like to think about the hustle and bustle that was going on there and this great envelope of silence and respect that followed these processions as all these cemeteries were moved out of South Quidnessett and then over to the Quidnessett Cemetery. Quite a remarkable job that was done there. And the burial area in Quidnessett Cemetery, which is a beautiful place, and as the fourth generation son of an undertaker, I spent a lot of time in cemeteries. But this is a beautiful place. It was designed to be a public park, and at some point during the summertime or spring, you should go over there and take a look at this section of Quidnessett, because it has some gravestones that go back to the 1600s. There are marker signs around this kind of eyeball shape or eye-shaped parcel of land that all these folks were moved to tell a little bit of their story. So, we talked about Quonset-Davisville being constructed initially for the Lend-Lease program, to be a supply base for England and Russia. But as the war came on, that all changed. And we all know, if you've lived for any longer than a year or two, you know that that it was the training ground, the training base for the beginnings of the Seabees. And Seabees is an interesting name for them. It sounds good, but it also stands for the letter C and the letter B, because that's what they were, naval construction battalions. So that's the C and the B. And they were headed off to fight in World War II. They were trained in both construction techniques and traditional combat readiness. And due to the specialized skills that CB possessed, they were typically as a group, the oldest groups of enlistees in the Army. They were skilled men who were sent out there to do some very difficult work, but they had to protect themselves as well. And, these men did things that were remarkable, and the folks who stayed on in Quonset-Davisville, designing the fabled Quonset hut, which was put up rapid fire. And they made these Quonset huts into kits so that a Quonset hut could be delivered on a ship and assembled in wartime in record time. Additionally, in West Davisville, there was a whole factory that was doing something that was really one of the untold stories of the base here, was designing and then constructing these pontoon sections, which were utilized in the European and Japanese theater. And one of my colleagues will have a great discussion about that in November, so I won't steal all of his thunder. But these pontoon sections were designed to be brought into Europe to be made into piers, and these pontoon sections were set up soon afterwards in the invasion of Normandy, so ships could tie up. These pontoon sections were then utilized as river crossings as the Germans retreated and blew up their bridges in the rivers, thinking they'd stop the Allied advances. These pontoon sections that were made here in Quonset-Davisville and shipped out to the war zone, and with a crew of Seabees ready to move them around and set it up, could be made into bridges that could carry tanks across the Rhone River in a heartbeat. And the same thing occurred in the Japanese theater, as they needed to get on one of these islands to be able to tie boats up to them of substantial size to supply these places, Guadalcanal, places like that. CB-made pontoon sections were utilized for that. So this particular technology developed here in North Kingstown was one of them very important to helping us win the war in a rapid-fire way. So during World War II, numerous aircraft carriers were stationed here during the war, and a whole bit of the Quonset Naval Air Station was really about outfitting and repairing the planes assigned to aircraft carriers. An aircraft carrier would come back from the European theater with shot-up planes in need of major repair. The ship itself needed repair. It would tie up at the docks in Quonset, and the planes would be flown off, landed in the airfield, brought to hangars, rebuilt as they needed, re-outfitted with newest technologies available, then flown back and land back on the aircraft carriers, and off they'd go. So that was really the business of the Quonset Naval Air Station during the war, was doing this, taking care of these airplanes that were on these aircraft carriers. I mean, and all of the great aircraft carriers that were in the European theater spent time here at Quonset getting this important service done. And thousands of folks worked here, not only military, but civilians. There were tons of civilian employees working at the base, fulfilling other duties. And most of those folks were North Kingstown folks that worked at the base. And if you've been in town for a while, everybody knows somebody who worked at Quonset or Davisville during the time frame, supporting whatever effort was going on there at that time. So the Cold War changed things for Quonset-Davisville. And it wasn't so much now about aircraft carriers. It now became a place that was a primary location for anti-submarine warfare activities, which was on the eastern seaboard. Worrying about Russian submarines being along the coast of the United States was their primary responsibility. Finding them, searching them out, looking for them, being prepared. This anti-submarine warfare units that were here at Quidnessett, were a critical part of the whole Cold War period. What nobody knew at the time frame, and not too many people know even now, is that in one of the more remote locations of the airfield out there was a special hangar, a special bunker that was put out there that was full of nuclear depth charges. That's how seriously they took the threat of Russian submarines trying to enter the waters of the United States, to go to, at the depth of the Cold War, people were really worried about these things. Russian submarines in New York Harbor, Russian submarines in the Narragansett Bay, these were things people were concerned about. And if they had come, one of those helicopters, those double rotor copters that used to fly around here in the 60s when I was a kid, would be loaded up with nuclear depth charges, and a small nuclear device would be dropped upon them. And of course, nobody knew that there were nuclear depth charges stored at Quonset until much later. And in the same time frame, another important part of what went on at Quonset Davisville was support and construction of all of the major settlements in Antarctica. Everything that's in Antarctica initially was built by U.S. Navy construction battalion folks from Quonset during an operation called Operation Deep Freeze, where all of these buildings were constructed by personnel from Quonset Davisville, flying down there with all these prefab buildings and setting them up. This is a view of one of the stations constructed out there in 1960 by my men from North Kingstown. Here's another shot of personnel of Operation Deep Freeze. Every year when they had this is the good weather time in Antarctica that you can see there. This is when it's really nice. Arriving at McMurdo Sound, getting ready to begin work expanding the various research bases down there in Antarctica. Supplies from home port and support facilities in Davisville can see here. If you can look closely at these boxes, you'd be able to see that they all are marked with coming from Davisville, Rhode Island. So all this stuff was shipped down to Antarctica from Davisville and then built there in Antarctica. Twice a year, all these things will be hauled down to Antarctica from the Narragansett Bay and dropped off there for the next year's building season in that delightful weather you saw on the last slide. And Quonset Davisville was an important military base right up to the end, and even during the Vietnam War. After the war, the base was slated for phase-out and closure by the Nixon administration. And the rest is history. I mean, Quonset sat kind of fallow for a while until it was turned over to the state of Rhode Island, and through fits and starts, it eventually developed into the vibrant, industrial park that it is today, supporting still military types of things with the massive amount of submarine work that goes on there through Electric Boat, but also more and more you're seeing 21st century industries in Quonset doing the kind of stuff that we can all be proud of. And now, as it becomes a place where we're going to move forward with being support and for construction of offshore wind. So that is our last slide here. Is that this shows us that this land in Quidnessett, this place, the land of many fires, as the native people would have called it, this place that was once the most densely settled place in the entire eastern seaboard for the Narragansett people, has had quite a story. And it's a remarkably interesting story that not enough people know about. I'm really glad you just spent the time with me here today to learn about the story of Quidnessett, and I'd be happy to answer questions. But before I do, I would like to point out my former colleague here, Elizabeth, who really helped me, Elizabeth Donovan, who really helped make this for us. She spent a lot of time putting up with me. And that's no easy task. She spent way more hours than anybody should have to spend with me. But we had a grand time photographing this and putting it together. And I'm so pleased she's here today because this is as much her work as it is mine. So thank you very much, Elizabeth. It's great to have you here. So I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody might have. No, thanks. Yeah, that's great. Yes.
The dock that when they took this over, was it where the carrier pier became during the war? Was that the dock you were?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. And it was expanded upon, but when it was there, what the government liked about it was they could bring the ships with supplies that were needed to build Quidnessett, because initially there was no rail line going in there. They had to build the rail line in order to continue to supply it, but they could get going because that dock was there. God, I did a good job. No questions?
What was the dividing line between North Quidnessett and South Quidnessett?
That's a good question. Newcomb Road is pretty close to it. I mean, the real dividing line is in the base now, but Newcomb Road, just a little bit south of Newcomb Road, would have been pretty much deciding, north to South Quidnessett. And it's amazing to think this entire village existed there, and it was just wiped off the bay by this construction of this base.
The picture said Camp Endicott.
Yes.
Is that Davisville?
Yes, right. That's one of the sections of Davisville. Yep. Yep. I mean, and another poor portion of what became Davisville was also the base of the Rhode Island militia camps, and that was beginning of that was Camp Endicott. But then it came up and was all kind of folded into the Quonset-Davisville complex. Yes.
Where really is Devil's Foot Rock?
Devil's Foot Rock is kind of across from the entry to Quonset. If you're driving up post roads heading north towards Quonset, you'll go through those series of new lights and they go over the tracks. If you're going north, on the left-hand side, there's a pull-off that's got a gravel parking area. That's right. If you go in there, right now there's some construction stuff there because I believe they're doing some replacement of some power poles. But if you go in there and you can walk up the rocks behind there, and it's actually a park of sorts. So you could go up there and take a look at it and see it. It's pretty intriguing place. Right. Yes, that's where the road was before they moved it over. Correct. Yep.
What does the word Quonset mean in the Narragansett language?
To be honest with you, I would just be yes. I don't really have that one in my head. I'm sure it has a language or it means something, but I expect it's probably been changed dramatically because they all were. But I'll have to look that one up for you. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer.
Well, this has been amazing for me because I worked on the flight deck in Vietnam on USS Kitty Hawk, and then for shore duty I came and I was stationed at Quonset in 71, 72. Got out and worked at the Naval Air Rework Facility. So this is like, wow, I didn't even know.
Blast from the past for you. I probably bumped into you at the QI or the TP on the post road, right? Yeah, I bet. where the MPs were going every night. And as an 17 or 18-year-old, that was the place you decided you wanted to go.
And I still get my hair cut by Sam's Barbershop, which I did originally like 40 years ago.
Yep, still by Sam, yeah. All right, thank you very much. Hope you have a great evening. I appreciate your time.